I had always known that words could cut deeper than any slap, but that night, under the suffocating glow of string lights and the curated perfection of my sister Madison's rooftop birthday party, they carved into me like glass. She didn't even have to raise her voice. With over 20 of her glitter-draped friends, colleagues, and followers gathered in an elegant circle of champagne and curated selfies, Madison delivered her blow with the ease of someone tossing off a joke they knew would land right where they wanted it. "There she is!" Madison purred, her voice sticky with that signature sweetness that fooled everyone but me. Our family disappointment. And look, she couldn't even bring a gift. Her words hung in the air, twisting around the marble columns and gold-trimmed dessert tables like smoke from a house fire. The laughter that followed was sharp, rehearsed, brittle in its cruelty. A chorus of people who didn't know me yet still laughed at me because Madison told them to. And of course, my mother Barbara played her part, laughing along with a nervous, glassy chuckle that sounded like it might crack under the weight of its own falseness. She didn't stop her. She never did. And my father Frank did what Frank always did when things got messy. He stared at the floor like the grains of wood might reveal some hidden escape route, swirling his glass of bourbon, as if maybe if he kept moving the amber liquid around long enough, he wouldn't have to see me at all. But Ben saw everything. My sweet, observant Ben. His small hand gripped mine tighter, and when I glanced down, his big, wondering eyes broke my heart in a way even Madison's words couldn't. "Mom," he whispered, his voice wobbling like he was fighting tears. "Why is Aunt Madison being so mean to you?" I forced a smile so brittle I thought it might splinter right off my face. Bending down, I brushed his curls from his forehead and pressed my lips gently to his temple. "It's okay, buddy," I whispered, though the words tasted like ash in my mouth. Sometimes people say things they don't really mean. But I knew better. Madison meant every syllable. And that was the moment something in me, something I had kept pressed down tight for years, quietly uncoiled. I reached into the worn leather tote I had placed carefully by my feet, my fingers brushing over the envelope I had almost left at home, almost buried at the bottom of a drawer where no one would ever see it. But not tonight. I stood, my body moving before my doubts could drag me back into that invisible corner where they always wanted me. I walked straight through the sea of sequins and artificial smiles, past the gaping mouths and raised eyebrows, and I handed the envelope to Madison without a word. It was plain, unadorned, aggressively simple against the gaudy cascade of designer-wrapped gifts she'd been parading like trophies all evening. She blinked down at it, her perfectly sculpted lips curling with amusement as she tore into it with all the theatrical flair of a woman expecting a groveling card or a desperate apology scribbled in cheap ink. But the moment her eyes locked onto the check inside, the smirk slid from her face like melting wax. The color drained from her skin so fast it was as if someone had snatched away all the glitter from the room. Her knees buckled beneath her, and with a gasp that sucked the laughter right out of the air, she collapsed onto the floor, clutching the check like it might burn her fingers. And then silence. The jazz band froze mid-note. The waiters stood paralyzed with trays balanced awkwardly mid-air, and somewhere in the distance the delicate clink of a glass breaking the hush sounded louder than thunder. No one spoke, no one dared, and in that perfect electric stillness I stood there, heart pounding so loud it echoed in my ears, but my face remained composed, my smile still firmly in place. Because in that moment, when all the world's noise seemed to fall away, I realized this was the shift I had been waiting for. If this story touches a place in you, if you've ever stood where I stood, wondering when your moment might come, do me a favor. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to remember they're not invisible, and subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories about finding your voice in unexpected places. Because as I've learned sometimes, the softest voice in the room is the one they remember. I never wanted to go to the party. It wasn't that I didn't care about my sister Madison. It wasn't even that I didn't wish her well in some distant, complicated way only siblings can understand. It was more the knowing exactly what the night would become. Madison's parties were never just parties. They were productions, gilded stages for her to bask in curated admiration, where every detail from the champagne fountains to the absurdly tall floral arrangements screamed for attention. And if you weren't part of the performance, you were inevitably the joke at the end of it. Still, when my mother Barbara called her voice brittle and sharp, beneath its usual saccharine sweetness, asking if I would finally be showing my face this year, I told her yes. I told her Ben and I would be there. I knew what it would mean if I didn't. another nail in the coffin of my already eroded family reputation. Another excuse for them to write me off as the sister who never showed up, never tried, never cared enough. The truth was, I was 32, divorced, raising Ben on my own. 2 part-time jobs kept our tiny world afloat, a bakery shift in the gray hours of dawn, and at night, administrative work in the back office of a dental clinic. It wasn't glamorous, it barely paid the bills. But it was honest work, and I never complained. I'd learned long ago how to make a $5 bill stretch to feed us both, how to patch my clothes instead of buying new ones, how to make sure Ben never felt the tightness that kept me awake most nights like a stone in my chest. Madison, though, she lived on another planet entirely. At 28, she had that kind of beauty that turned heads without effort, like it was baked into her skin. She was the influencer, the girl with the sleek high-rise apartment downtown, the closet full of handbags sent to her for free by brands desperate for a piece of her aura. She knew how to work a room, how to spin people's attention like silk, especially when she wanted something from them. And she had Barbara, our mother, wrapped tightly around her manicured finger. Barbara, who always looked like she'd stepped out of a lifestyle magazine with her perfect smile and nails always painted in deep, expensive reds. She loved to remind anyone who'd listen that both of her daughters had been raised with grace, with standards, with class. Yet in her eyes there was only one daughter who'd lived up to that. And it wasn't me. My father, Frank, was quieter, more prone to disappearing into the glow of his phone or his wine glass when things got uncomfortable. He was never cruel, at least not directly, but he never stood up for me either. That was his specialty. Absence. But Ben was my world. 9 years old, and already brimming with more heart and empathy than most people twice his age. He saw everything, the smallest frowns, the pauses in conversations, the cracks I tried so hard to plaster over. I had done everything in my power to make sure he saw strength when he looked at me, not struggle. And yet, in moments like these, when we brushed shoulders with my family, I wondered what reflections he caught in those sharp, cold mirrors. That night before we left the house, I dressed him in his best shirt, the one I'd found on clearance last winter, and saved carefully for special occasions like this. I slipped into a dress I hadn't worn in years, touched up my makeup with trembling fingers, and stared at myself in the mirror, trying to conjure the kind of confidence I didn't quite feel. We drove the dented old Corolla toward the venue parking blocks away, because valet wasn't for people like us. When we arrived, the rooftop was already brimming with polished bodies and hollow laughter. White balloons floated above gold-trimmed tables, a live band played the kind of jazz that made you feel like you should whisper, and waiters in black carried trays of miniature crab cakes and drinks that sparkled like starlight. At the center of it all was Madison, laughing, radiant, dressed like a movie star, in a silver gown that clung to her like armor. She saw me, of course, but the way she looked through me, like I was a smudge on her perfect night, that was the real performance. "Hey," I said, my smile tight, polite, rehearsed. "Happy birthday." She offered me a side hug that barely brushed my shoulder. "Wow, you actually showed up," she said with that syrupy bite that never failed to land somewhere under my ribs. Then turning to Ben, her voice softened like she was switching on a filter. "Hey there, kiddo." I forced a smile that felt like it might crack my face in two and led Ben to a quiet corner of the terrace away from the sheen and sparkle. He asked for a soda, but the bar didn't stock anything that wasn't soaked in alcohol. When I asked a waiter if there was water for kids, he blinked at me like I was speaking in tongues and wandered off, leaving me standing there, unseen, unimportant, irrelevant. But it wasn't just the luxury or the side eyes. It was the suffocating certainty that in this world I would always be the warning, never the dream. Madison was everything they wanted to be around. And me, I was the sister they paraded, only to remind themselves what not to become. But I stayed. For Ben. For the moment I had planned meticulously for weeks. I wasn't there to beg for scraps of approval. I had something in my bag they didn't expect. And despite the stares, the whispers, the tightening of my throat, I lifted my chin and reminded myself my moment was coming. And when it did, I would make sure they saw it. As the night unfurled, the laughter grew louder, harsher, more suffocating. I kept my mask on, answering questions from distant relatives who acted like I was a stranger who had wandered in by mistake. They couldn't hide their surprise that I still lived in the same part of town, working what they called little jobs, with that same patronizing tone that made my skin crawl. One of my cousins even leaned in and asked if I was finally dating again, as if my singleness was a stain I should be ashamed of. I smiled, chuckled even. I had grown used to them mistaking my resilience for failure. But that night something deeper thrummed beneath the surface, a pressure I could feel in my bones. And in the pit of my stomach I knew Madison would be the one to strike the final blow. About an hour in, she took the small stage near the bar as though the entire night had been written just for her. The band hushed, a spotlight flickered to life, and there she was, glass held aloft, her voice smooth and silky, as she delivered a flawless performative speech. She thanked her friends, her fans, and of course our parents for always believing in her, her words floating over the crowd like polished pearls. Not once did she acknowledge me, not even a glance. Then, as if cued by an invisible director, someone called out, "Open your gifts, Madison." The crowd roared, eager for the next act in the show. She laughed, perfect and bright, flicked her hair, and began tearing into the sea of elegantly wrapped packages, designer perfumes, shimmering jewelry spa getaways. I watched from the edge of the crowd, Ben leaning heavily into me, his eyelids drooping. "Just a few more minutes, sweetheart," I whispered into his hair, holding him close. Madison held up the plain white envelope I had handed her when we arrived, its unassuming presence clashing almost violently against the shimmer of her manicured hands, nails painted in a shade of gold that probably cost more than my entire outfit. She lifted it toward the crowd like she was holding a prop in one of her carefully choreographed performances. "What's this?" she asked loud enough to hush the surrounding murmurs, her voice dripping with faux innocence as she turned slowly, theatrically to face the audience she so adored. "Oh, it's from Sarah," she added with a theatrical sigh, like the words themselves were a punchline. Heads swiveled toward me, necks craning curiosity tinged with the familiar undercurrent of condescension. I felt it then, the flush creeping up the back of my neck, a fiery crawl that made the skin under my makeup prickle with humiliation. Madison, always the ringmaster, waved the envelope in the air like it was a joke she had been rehearsing all night. "Guess she couldn't even afford wrapping paper," she sneered, her laughter brittle-cutting and, worst of all, infectious. A few guests chuckled obligingly, the kind of shallow laughter that fills empty rooms and leaves behind the stench of pity. My stomach sank. It always amazed me how quickly humiliation could spread like a virus, infecting the entire rooftop, bouncing off the glass railings and perfectly arranged centerpieces, landing squarely on my chest with the weight of an anchor. And Madison wasn't done yet. She raised her voice as if ensuring no one, not even the staff hiding by the elevators, could miss the joke. She probably couldn't even afford a gift, she crowed. The laughter turned mean, then sharper, heavier, as though the crowd was finally letting themselves enjoy the cruelty they'd been holding back. I felt the ache in my jaw from holding my smile too tightly, the burn behind my eyes, that I swallowed down like a bitter pill. My mother, Barbara, chuckled softly, nervously, as though laughing along might disguise the cracks in her perfect facade. She did nothing to stop Madison. She never had. My father, Frank, found sudden fascination in his wristwatch, his face a mask of practiced detachment, as though the ticking of the second hand might transport him anywhere but here. And then there was Ben, my beautiful boy, who looked up at me with those wide, questioning eyes that broke me in ways no one else ever could. "Mom," he whispered, tugging at my arm, his voice small and shaking. "Why is Aunt Madison saying that stuff about you?" I knelt down, brushing his curls from his forehead, willing the tightness in my throat to loosen. "It's okay, buddy," I whispered, forcing a smile that cracked at the edges. "Sometimes people say things they don't really understand." But I wasn't sure I believed that anymore. Madison knew exactly what she was doing. And something inside me shifted then. It wasn't rage, not the wild shaking kind. It wasn't sorrow, though it sat there heavy and familiar, a constant ache in my bones. It was something deeper, quieter, steadier. A voice I'd long kept locked away, finally rising, whispering the word I'd been afraid to speak for too long. Enough. I released Ben's hand gently, as if letting go of more than just his tiny fingers. I walked through the crowd, not rushing, not stumbling, but with the kind of calm that makes people step aside without knowing why. The sequins and champagne glasses blurred around me as I stepped right up to Madison, who blinked momentarily, thrown by the fact that I was daring to challenge her script. If you're going to open it, I said, my voice soft but steady. Go ahead. Madison tilted her head, thrown off by my calmness, but unwilling to let the show slip from her grip. She ripped open the envelope with a dramatic flourish, fully expecting some pitiful handwritten card, a last-ditch attempt to save face. But the moment her eyes fell upon the check, her smirk faltered. She blinked, confusion morphing into disbelief as she scanned the check, then the letter, then the check again, as though the numbers might rearrange themselves into something her mind could accept. The crowd leaned in, the laughter dying as abruptly as it had erupted. Madison stood frozen, her lips parted, the words she so often weaponized, lost somewhere between her throat and the choking realization settling into her chest. She staggered back, not with the exaggerated flair she was known for, but like someone whose body simply couldn't support them anymore. She collapsed onto the edge of a lounge chair, the envelope and its contents clutched in trembling hands. The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the band, sensing the seismic shift in the air, abandoned their instruments mid-note. Waiters stood motionless, glasses and trays hovering in awkward limbo. Even the rooftop breeze seemed to hold its breath. No one knew yet what was in that envelope, but everyone knew something had shattered, and all eyes turned to me. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel small, didn't feel like the afterthought or the mistake or the family embarrassment. I felt powerful because I knew exactly what I had placed in her hands and exactly why. And yet, I wasn't done. Everyone stared at Madison, but my gaze found Ben. And what I saw in his eyes wasn't confusion anymore. It wasn't fear. It was something purer, something that reached into the marrow of me and soothed old wounds' pride. He didn't know the details yet, but he knew in that intuitive way only children can, that something had just changed. That his mother, who had spent so much of her life trying not to cause a ripple, had just sent a tidal wave crashing through the room. I turned back to Madison. She sat there small for the first time in her life, her silver dress pooling around her hands trembling as they held the check and the letter, as if they were something dangerous, something alive. She blinked up at me, her pupils wide and disoriented, like she was trying to claw her way back to reality. But I didn't speak yet. Not yet. Because no one here knew what I had been doing, what I had built. They never asked. They never cared. For a year and a half, I had worked in silence, waking before the sun to bake, while Ben slept upstairs, pouring every spare second into building an online business from scratch. I had always loved making natural skincare products, lotions, scrubs, lip balms, and I started small Etsy orders that barely covered postage, selling at farmers markets, packing orders by hand and writing thank you notes late into the night. After Ben was asleep, I buried myself in online courses, free, cheap, anything I could find, branding, digital marketing, business basics. It was never glamorous. There were months I made $20 after costs, months I wanted to quit but didn't. And then 6 months ago, a TikTok video I posted showing how I made a body butter from scratch went viral. Suddenly I had over 40,000 followers. Orders flooded in. And then the message from Chelsea Morgan, a woman who ran an e-commerce investment group for women-owned businesses. She saw what I'd built and believed in it. She offered to partner with me to help scale my brand. 3 weeks before tonight, the papers were signed. My share of the deal, $40,000. Not a lottery win, but enough to pay off my car, enough to breathe, enough to give Ben more than just enough. And still I told no one in my family, because I wasn't doing it for them. I didn't want their applause or their sudden pride. I just wanted to do it my way, quietly, honestly. But when Madison turned me into the night's joke in front of Ben, in front of everyone, I realized I wasn't here to be polite. I was here to rewrite the story they had always told about me. The check I chose, $25,000. Enough to stun her, enough to make a statement, but not enough to ruin her. And the letter I spent 2 agonizing hours writing. For years I've watched you chase dreams. Talk about starting a fashion line, waiting for someone else to fund it. I figured you'd never expect it to come from me. But here's a start. Use it wisely or don't. Either way, this isn't about the money. It's about proving that I am not who you say I am. I never was. From your sister, the one you called a failure. I hadn't planned to hand it to her in front of everyone. But when she called me out, I didn't flinch. I handed it over because I wanted her to see me. Really see me. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to make a scene. I had already done the loudest thing a quiet woman can do. I built something that spoke for me, and now the entire room knew. Madison clutched the check like it might spark and burn her. Her fingers hovered over the letter, her perfect nails trembling as she read and reread the words, her eyes flickering back and forth like she was trying to decipher a foreign language. I stood there calm, steady, still. No rage, no smugness, just truth. And then finally she found her voice, though it cracked under the weight of disbelief. Is this real?" she whispered. There was no performance in her voice now, no audience, no filter. "Yes," I said softly. Madison's gaze darted toward our parents, her expression flickering between confusion and something dangerously close to panic. My mother, Barbara, stood rigid, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows arched so high they nearly disappeared into her carefully set hairline. She looked to Frank, who had finally abandoned his pretense of scrolling through his phone, his hand now hanging uselessly by his side as he stared at me, really stared at me, with the bewildered expression of a man seeing his own child for the first time. The silence spread across the rooftop like spilled wine, staining every corner with its thick, sticky discomfort. For a moment, it felt like no one dared to breathe, as if the entire city might crumble beneath the weight of this unraveling performance. And then it was Jake, my cousin, the one who always said what others wouldn't, who broke the tension. His voice, low and curious, cut through the hush like a knife through velvet. "What's in the envelope?" Madison blinked as though she had forgotten it was still in her trembling hands. She glanced down at the check again, her voice barely a thread of sound when she finally answered. "It's a check. From Sarah." The words hung there awkward and heavy, as though their meaning didn't quite compute in her world, where I was always the one needing help, never the one offering it. She said it like a contradiction, like she couldn't believe it, even as she spoke it aloud. Uncle Rob leaned forward, the glint of curiosity overtaking even his usual stoic calm. "How much?" Madison hesitated, her throat bobbing as she swallowed hard, then held up the check for all to see. The number, bold and unapologetic, gleamed under the harsh rooftop lights. 25,000. A collective gasp swept through the crowd like a ripple of shock slapping across the glossy surface of their carefully arranged lives. And suddenly, all those eyes, once so quick to dismiss me, turned in my direction, laden with questions they wouldn't dare voice. Why was this some kind of elaborate joke, a stunt? But Madison, still clutching the check like it might ignite in her hands, spoke again, her voice laced with a kind of fragile disbelief that caught me off guard. She gave me this to start my fashion business. She stammered as though she had to hear herself say it to believe it. She said she believes in me." Those words, those simple, aching words, hit harder than I expected, slicing through years of bitterness like a blade. Because they were true. Despite everything, despite her jabs and her cruelty, and the way she had made me feel like nothing for so long, I had still written that check without conditions, without bitterness, without revenge laced into the ink. I hadn't done it to see her fail. I hadn't done it to humiliate her. I did it to end the story they had always written about me. "She believes in me," Madison repeated softer this time, as if saying it again might make it more real. And no one laughed now. There were no smug smiles or clever remarks. Even the waitstaff stood frozen, their trays held aloft in awkward stillness. The music, once the pulsing heartbeat of Madison's grand spectacle, was gone, leaving only the sound of the wind brushing over the rooftop's edge. My mother finally stepped forward, her heels clicking against the tile like an accusation. She looked at me as though I were a puzzle she had never learned how to solve, her voice brittle, careful. "Sarah," she said, her words measured like she feared what I might say. "What is this?" I met her gaze steady and unflinching. "It's success," I told her, "the kind you didn't see coming." I didn't say it to wound her, though a part of me knew it probably did. I said it because it was the truth. For the first time in my life, I wasn't standing at the edge of the party waiting for someone to pull out a chair for me. I wasn't begging to be seen. I had taken my place at the table on my terms. Without another word, I turned and walked back to Ben, who was still standing in the corner, clutching a half-melted chocolate from the dessert table, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Are we leaving now?" he asked softly, his voice steady in a way that made my heart swell. "Yeah," I said, leaning down to kiss the top of his head, breathing in the sweetness of him, the innocence, the safety. "We're leaving." We walked through the stunned crowd, their faces frozen in disbelief, their conversations stifled by the heaviness that lingered like smoke. Frank opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came, only the hollow gape of a man realizing he had never truly seen his daughter until tonight. Madison didn't speak either. She remained behind me, still clutching that envelope like it weighed more than anything she had ever held before. As we neared the elevator, someone I didn't recognize whispered into the silence. That was the most badass thing I've ever seen. Ben looked up at me, his face blooming into a grin. "Were they talking about you?" I smiled too, and for once it didn't feel forced. "I think so," I said. We rode the elevator down in silence, the kind that wasn't hollow or suffocating, but sacred, full of space and breath, and something that felt dangerously close to freedom. When the doors opened and the cool night air washed over my skin, it felt like a reward. I buckled Ben into his seat and sat behind the wheel for a long moment, letting the silence settle over me like a blanket, soft and whole. Not the silence of being overlooked, but the silence of finally being heard. That envelope hadn't been just paper and ink. It had been a declaration, a full sentence in a voice I had kept hidden for too long. I wasn't the family failure. I was the one who refused to quit, the one who built something real when no one was looking. And now finally they saw me. The next morning my phone was still. No passive-aggressive texts, no vague family group chats, pinging with updates, or forwarded memes from Barbara. Just silence. And God, it felt good. Ben and I made pancakes, letting him dump in far too many chocolate chips. We ate them in our tiny kitchen, the sun pouring through the cracked blinds, painting everything gold. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't bracing for judgment, or waiting for the next rejection to knock me back down. I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. I had already done that. It wasn't until noon that a message from Madison appeared on my phone. Just a single sentence. "Can we talk?" I stared at it for a long time, not out of fear or obligation, but because for the first time I had the power to decide how the next chapter unfolded. Not on her terms, on mine. I waited a few hours before responding. "Sure, but not today." That night my phone rang again. This time it was Uncle Rob. He didn't skirt around the subject or dance around the discomfort like the others had. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. And then after a pause, thick with meaning, "It's about time someone made them all look in the mirror." It was the only call I answered. In the days that followed, the ripples of that night spread. Barbara started tagging me in her Facebook posts, my daughter Sarah, the entrepreneur. She didn't mention that she hadn't supported a single step of the journey, but I didn't correct her. I didn't need to. Frank called once, his voice brittle and awkward as he admitted, "I'm sorry I didn't speak up that night." "I understand," I told him. And I did. He was never the loud one. He was the one who hid behind the noise. But in the end, the biggest shift came not from the check or the spectacle on that rooftop, but from a moment so small, so unadorned, it could have been overlooked if I hadn't been paying attention. A few days later, on an ordinary Tuesday, Ben came home from school, his face alight with a secret he couldn't contain. He pressed a handmade card into my hands, the kind fashioned from construction paper with crooked edges and glitter that clung to everything destined to live forever, in the fibers of our worn carpet. On the front, in the uneven, determined scrawl of a 9-year-old still mastering his cursive, he had written, "My mom is a boss." Inside, he had drawn a picture of me, cape billowing behind me, a giant check clutched in one hand, my other hand raised like I was about to take on the world. The drawing was crude, the colors bleeding outside the lines, but to me, it might as well have been a masterpiece hanging in a gallery. The next morning, after I dropped him off at school, I sat alone in the car, the morning light slanting through the windshield, and I let the tears come. I cried in the quiet, not out of sadness, but from the overwhelming, bone-deep feeling that no check, no viral video, no signed deal could ever touch that raw, unfiltered, knowing that my son saw me not as a woman, bowed under the weight of other people's expectations, not as the family's cautionary tale, but as someone fierce and capable and unbreakable. As a mother who didn't flinch when it would have been easier to fold. A woman who stood her ground. That night on the rooftop hadn't fixed everything, of course. Madison didn't transform into a new person overnight. She remained who she had always been, dramatic, sharp, still believing the world spun faster when she was at the center of it. But the next time we crossed paths, something in her was different. Subtler, quieter, like a balloon with just enough air let out to ground it. She didn't offer me the apology I had once fantasized about, the tearful confession where she admitted all the ways she had been wrong. Instead, she handed me a small, unassuming box. Inside was a delicate gold bracelet, nothing extravagant, but real, simple, sincere in a way that felt heavier than its weight. Attached was a tag that read, "To the strongest sister I know." We didn't hug, we didn't cry, we didn't have a grand reconciliation. But something in the space between us shifted, not erased, but altered like a crack in old porcelain, that while still visible, made the piece more valuable somehow. For the first time in years, it felt like we might learn to coexist, not as best friends, not as the inseparable sisters we had once pretended to be, but as women who, after all the wreckage, finally saw each other as equals. I don't think my family will ever forget that night, not because of the number on the check, but because for once, the girl they had spent years underestimating stood tall and spoke volumes without ever raising her voice. And here's what I've learned in the quiet aftermath. You don't have to scream to be powerful. You don't need their validation to be valuable. And you certainly don't have to wait for permission to succeed. Sometimes the people who doubt you the loudest are simply the ones who gave up on their own dreams. And sometimes the kindest, fiercest thing you can do for yourself is to stop shrinking so others can feel comfortable in your presence. Because your success is not an apology, it is a declaration. And sometimes all it takes to rewrite the entire story is one envelope, one truth, and the courage to hand it over with a smile that says, "I was never who you thought I was." And if you've made it this far with me, if you felt even a flicker of yourself in these words, maybe you too have an envelope moment waiting inside you. If this story stirred something in you, maybe a whisper you've long been silencing, do me a small kindness. Like this video so others like us can find it. Share it with someone who has been overlooked, underestimated, or silenced. And tell me, have you ever had your own envelope moment? I read every word.